Alrighty, let's build a DDL trigger. Now, our challenge is to build a trigger that captures information into the DDL trigger watcher database, and we're going to watch for activity in the DDL trigger database. Let's first just run this initial set of testing commands, and at this point, I'm just making sure that they work. I do not have a DDL trigger set up at all yet. And let's look in server objects here. Let's actually expand the correct object there. And if I look in server objects here and I refresh here, I do not have anything under the triggers folder yet. So I do not yet have a DDL trigger created there. My first iteration of this, whenever I'm building something like this, I want to look at the documentation on DDL events and I want to look at the documentation on event data. When I look at these, let's go ahead and open these up here, and I'll do control click. It's not one, if you do control click, I think I have my shortcut keys messed up here for my VM, so it doesn't want to open it there. You can use Management Studio as a browser. It's not really the best practice, but let's go ahead and look at the event data function doc. And the event data function doc, essentially this doc is helping break down and giving you some sample ways to look at the data that comes back from different events. So here we have an example trigger, and it's taking the data as an XML data type and saying, okay, we have a variable named data that's XML data type. We're going to set it to event data, and then it helps give you information on how to shred that out into different things like event type and T-SQL commands. There's all sorts of different examples. There's really one example in here that can be helpful. The documentation on DDL events helps you look at what are the different kind of events that you can pick up. So you can pick up things like I can respond to a create certificate or an alter certificate, for example. So we want things like table, right? We want create table. So we might search here for create table and alter table. And if we search here for rename, for example, we can get rename events. So this is the page that if I'm looking at what events can I pick up, that can be very, very useful there. So for our first iteration here, I am creating our DDL trigger, DDL watcher. And I'm creating it on all server because I want to pick this up across not just one database, but anywhere on the instance that something happens, I want to pick this up because I want to log these into the watcher database, but I want to see stuff in other databases. So I am doing this for create table, alter table, drop table, and rename based on those samples that we have. And right now I'm just setting the body of this to be really really simple. Rather, declaring event data as XML. I am setting it to event data, and then I am just returning it back so I can look at this. I would not want to ship this to production, right? Because every time someone does a create table, alter table, drop table, or rename, it's now going to start returning them a result set. But I need to put that result set into a table. So first thing, I just want to look at what does that result set look like. I'm going to go ahead and create this trigger. And now when I refresh the triggers folder here, now I do have a trigger named DDL watcher in there. And I, like other things in Management Studio, I can also script it to a new query window. So I can see that actually when I script it, there's actually a create and then an enable trigger because this can be disabled. If I right click it here, there is disable toggle there, right? I don't have to just delete it. I could disable that if I wanted to. Now I'm going to rerun that activity just so I can look at the data that is returned or the data that's captured by the DDL trigger every time I run these. So each command now, one of my things I want to know is each command causing the DDL trigger to fire or have I missed anything? And I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 result sets back for 6 commands. So all 6 did cause the trigger to fire. And I can see also, right, create table. This is an alter, this is an alter, this is an alter, this is a rename, this is a drop. But I may want to look at the details. For the create table, This helps me see what are the different pieces of information that I can pull apart. There's an event type, post time. So each of these, it gives me information for the T-SQL command. There's actually a whole list of set options if I want those. And then there's the command text. In the Trigger Watcher database, I already have a list of columns for what I want to capture. So now I can map those to it. In other words, the set options are not in here, but the T-SQL command is in there too. So depending on actually what you want to capture for the T-SQL command, I am just going to capture the command text personally. But if you wanted to figure out how to actually get all of that in there, you could. It would probably, if you were going to capture both of those, it would probably make sense to put a separate column in, I would think, for the T-SQL command, but you might even choose to break it out even more depending on what you wanted to do for different settings. But personally, I'm just capturing the command text there. So that's for this one is the create table one. And create table doesn't have new object name. I didn't do a rename, so I just have object name. I don't have new object name. If I look at my other result sets though, specifically if I look at the rename result set, this one does have both object name and then the new object name. So I need to know what these things are. In terms of being able to shred it, I need to know, okay, what is returned by the command that I actually want to capture. So looking through those result sets that way helps me do it. All right, so we have done our first iteration here, which just let us take a look at what comes back. Our second iteration, I do want to split out that column information. Now that I've looked at those result sets, I can now say, all right, I've got the same list of things I want to fire. I want to actually break this out into columns, name, event type, post time, etc., etc. And I'm really just using that pattern from the documentation that says, okay, I want to shred this XML and return these items for each of them. I do need to specify the data type for each of them, and I have that in the table already to specify the data type. So let's go ahead and iteration 2, let's modify I'm doing creator alter here. So that says, oh, DDL Watcher already exists. Let's go ahead and recreate that trigger. And now let's go back up and rerun that activity. Now, I'm still not inserting the data anywhere. This is still not something I would want to ship anywhere, right? Because I am just selecting this data. So when I run a drop table, now I'm just going to get a result set back, which someone just running a drop table, that's not what they would expect. I'm still in the testing phase here, just wanting to say, all right, does this make sense? So for the create table, do my results look right? Okay, the post time looks right. These looks right. New object name is null. That makes sense because I'm not renaming things and I can see and review this information. For my rename down here, I do have both object name and new object name. If I'd gotten my parsing wrong, like if my X query wasn't right, I might have a null there when I expect to see something there, but I am seeing what I expect to see there. Now, my next iteration, that was the second iteration. At this point, I do want to say, okay, I want to go ahead and insert rows into the DDL Watcher table, and I'm also going to set no count on. Because someone dropping a table, I don't want them to necessarily see the row count from the DDL trigger running. So I'm saying inside the DDL trigger, I'm also saying set no count on. So I'm doing create or alter again. And now I have added in this part. So now I'm not just selecting the results. I'm inserting into the SQLChallenge DDL Trigger Watcher database, dbo.ddl Watcher table, the data into those. All right, so let's go ahead and create our alter there. And once again, we're going to go back to the top and we are going to run our activity there. So I do still get this warning. This is just a normal warning from SP Rename that renaming isn't always perfect. My code may reference something with the old name, but I can run this again and again. I don't have an obvious indication here that my DDL trigger is firing, which is what we want. We don't necessarily want users to be bothered by the DDL trigger running. Now that I've done that activity and it's had a chance to capture something, I can now select out of my DDL watcher table and see, sure enough, I've run this multiple times, and each time it's putting in 6 commands. So I've run this set of 6 commands 4 times. So I have 24 rows, and looking over at these rows, each of them, when I have the rename, I have the old name and the new name, and everything looks like it is running as I expect. Now there's that second set of testing commands here. What happens when we're running as Stormy? So this is the same as the set of testing commands. I've just taken out the little bits that say, hey, verify what my username is, because we already established that in the challenge setup that when I do exec as user Stormy, it does have me run as the low permission user Stormy who only has permission to the SQLChallenge DDL trigger database. If I run this set of commands as Stormy, this used to work before the DDL trigger was created, because Stormy does have permissions to do these things. But one of the gotchas with DDL triggers are that they are tightly coupled with the code. If they are part of the transaction, so when Stormy is creating a table, the code in the DDL trigger that inserts data into the table in another database, that is part of Stormy's transaction. And if that fails, Stormy's entire transaction rolls back. And Stormy gets an error, which may really confuse that user, especially in a situation where, like, if someone created this DDL trigger and didn't tell everybody else about it, like, different parts of the application could start just failing unexpectedly because of lack of permissions to insert rows into the DDL trigger table, which is exactly what's happening here. The error on these is I cannot, the first one fails. The create table fails. And then the alter table fails because the create table failed. It was not able to create the table. So the alter table fails, and then this one fails because it's also dependent, and all of the rest of them fail as well because the DDL trigger is part of the transaction. One way to fix this is this. And I have, by the way, I've reverted. So I'm no longer running as that low permission user. I'm now running as me who has high permission. One way to fix this is to say, I am going to, on the database where the table is that the DDL trigger logs to, I'm going to let the public role connect to that. Like, everyone who's in public can get into that database, and everyone who's in public can insert into the DDL watcher table. Now, this does mean that Stormy could manually write inserts to that table. It's true. However, would Stormy really do that? Are we really worried about that? If we're not really worried about that, this can be an option. But whatever I have that trigger doing, I need to make sure that people have permission to do it, because since this is tightly coupled in the transaction, since DDL triggers are tightly coupled like that, I really don't want my trigger to just make their commands fail. If I don't want them to be tightly coupled, I need to find another way to do this, right? If this type of thing, if granting insert to that table is not okay, well, I'm going to have to think of a more complex way to do it. This is a nice, simple way that I think can work in many situations. Now that I have made that permission change, I'm going to go back and run this block of code that runs as Stormy. And now that Stormy has permissions to connect to that database, to insert into that table, this works. I've run that multiple times, and now if I look at my table again that's been logging again, I can look down and see, here's the ones I ran as myself, said here is the login name and username that did that, and here are all of the ones that ran by Stormy. Now, since I created Stormy as this strange user who doesn't have a login, the login name doesn't, just shows up as a weird SID there, but I can see based on the username that was Stormy. So that's one way to solve that permission problem without making Stormy a sysadmin user. In a later challenge, we are going to explore how we could do this in a more loosely coupled fashion without having the code in the DDL trigger, without having it be part of the transaction itself of the command. We'll be testing out event notifications in a future SQL challenge. Now, another tricky thing, or a tip, I guess, that can help do this is on mssqltips.com. There's an article here. Let's take a look at this article. And in this article, I just want to bring this up here to show whose work this is. This is done by Aaron Bertrand, the very smart Aaron Bertrand. And he had written a previous tip about DDL triggers. And he heard from a user in the follow-up that another thing that could sometimes cause the issue to fail is that snapshot isolation can be tricky. So to avoid, if you are using snapshot isolation, right? So if we are running the transaction in snapshot isolation in a database and we want to insert something into that table in another database, we need to allow snapshot isolation in the other database. So in this case, the example, this is just a quote from that post. In that case, it was audit DB where we set snapshot isolation on. In our example, the watcher database is the one, right? The trigger says, okay, as part of your transaction, you're going to insert into a table in this database. In our example, if snapshot isolation was on in one of the databases we were watching on the instance, we would also need to enable it on the watcher database. So in the case of the article, it was audit DB. In our case, it's that watcher database. So if we run this command and we had that scenario, that should take care of that as well. But do know that with DDL triggers, because they're tightly coupled, and because the code in the DDL trigger becomes part of the transaction of what it's watching, you have to be really careful and really good about sharing this change with other people and documenting it and testing things so that when you introduce the DDL trigger, you don't create a lot of chaos. Well, and by chaos, I mean specifically you don't make a bunch of things fail that were succeeding before. That's not anyone's idea of a good change there, right? So I'm going to go ahead and run our little cleanup script here where we drop the trigger. Notice, by the way, that when we're cleaning up, we do need to say drop trigger on all server. This is a server level DDL trigger. So to get this to go away, let's go back to our server level trigger here, right? If I just say drop trigger if exists DDL watcher and I don't highlight the all server, because I said if exists, my command was successful, but it didn't look at the server level triggers at all because I didn't say on all server. It was looking for a database scoped trigger. So now if I say drop trigger if exists DDL watcher on all server, now I've cleaned up the trigger there. And because it's a server level trigger, it doesn't reside in that watcher database. So now I'm going to go ahead and drop my databases, except in order to drop a database, I need to not be in it. So let's go ahead and use the master database at the beginning of our cleanup script there. And now I have cleaned up my databases. Thank you for joining me for this DDL trigger SQL challenge. I'll see ya in the next SQL challenge, and we'll talk about event notifications, which have a whole different set of pros and cons to DDL triggers. Thanks, folks.